Russia, or officially the Russian Federation in Russian Rossiyski or Rossiyskaya Federatsiya. Hopefully I got the name right. Functionally I cannot speak Russian, sorry, despite having lived for most of my life in one of its many neighbors, namely Finland. It is the world's largest country. Its land area, or its total area, is over 17 million square kilometers. When it was still known as the Soviet Union, and it was by far the largest Soviet republic, that now defunct country's total area was over 22 million square kilometers. In other words, Russia has lost some 5 million square kilometers of its area as a result of the Soviet Union's breakup. However, following a controversial and probably rigged referendum in early 2016 in the Crimean Peninsula, Russia unilaterally annexed it. Most other countries of the world, including especially most European countries, North America and Australia and New Zealand, however, have not legally recognized or officially recognized this annexation. Excluding the Crimean Peninsula, Russia currently has a population of over 144 million people. Some 110 million people live in the European part of Russia, while the rest live in the Asian part of Russia. Russia spans the entire northern part of Asia and even parts of Central and of course Eastern Asia, and because it occupies that area in the Asian Far East, it is even a neighbor of the United States, because the Bering Strait, a relatively narrow strait of the Pacific Ocean, separates Russia from Alaska in the Asian Far East. So, which countries are Russia's neighbors? So the United States is one, and the United States, of course, is a North American country. Then we have Japan. After that we have, let's put on my eyeglasses. North Korea, although they have a short boundary only in Eastern Asia. Then China, of course. After that, Mongolia. Then Kazakhstan. Then Azerbaijan. After that, Georgia. And following Georgia, we have the Ukraine. After Ukraine, Belarus, also known as White Russia. Then Poland, because of the Kaliningrad exclave between Lithuania and Poland. Lithuania, of course. Then Latvia. Then Estonia. After that, my distant native land in Northern Europe, Finland. And finally, Norway. Russia is ethnically a diverse country, although a clear majority of its people are so-called Great Russians, because traditionally the Russians were divided into three groups: the Great Russians, often known simply as Russians, the Little Russians or the Ukrainians, and then the White Russians, or now the Belarusians. Russia has no official religion, although the Russian Orthodox Church does have some kind of special status, and contrary to many other Christian churches, it is not subject really to surveillance by the government. After the enfeebled President Boris Yeltsin chose to resign at the end of December 1999, and then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, as acting president of Russia, was chosen as his successor in March 2000 and took office for the first time in May 2000. Especially the evangelical, Pentecostal and charismatic Christians in Russia, whether native born or then foreign born, and then the missionaries and pastors, preachers, evangelists and so forth, have found themselves increasingly being discriminated against and even surveyed. Recently, if I remember correctly, either earlier this year or in 2017, the Russian Federal Parliament passed a law that supposedly was designed to crack down on the religious cults, but in practice made evangelism, the Christian evangelism, difficult to do outside the church buildings. So in that sense, sadly, as far as the religious freedom is concerned, the Russian Federation seems to be heading back towards the severe restrictions and even persecutions of true Christians and then other religious people that, for example, the Soviet Union was notorious for. Anyway, because of its wide territory, vast territory stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to the Far Eastern Asia, Russia spans 11 time zones and has many different geographical features in terms of vegetation and even climate. However, as a generalization, we can say that Russia mostly has a rather severe continental climate. In the far north, of course, it is already Arctic or at least subarctic, although even most of Siberia does experience the summer every year. However, it is brief, although the temperatures can then soar even into the 30s, at least into the 20s. However, the winters are cold, snowy, and long, especially in northern and eastern Russia. But even Moscow, Russia's famous capital, does experience rather severe winters. There, however, the spring comes clearly faster than, for example, in Novosibirsk or New Siberia, which is the official capital of Russia's Siberia region. Russia does have a huge coastline in the north on the Arctic Ocean. And then in the east on the Pacific Ocean. However, in the west it has a rather short coastline on the Baltic Sea, which is, as we know, classified as an inland sea because it is only connected to the next sea, or the North Sea, through the narrow Danish Straits. This means that the Gulf Stream, that warm stream that originates in the tropical Caribbean islands and then stretches all the way to the western coast of Europe, and which does so much to warm up western and central and northern Europe's climate, barely reaches Russia's northern coastline, which means that in the winter time the fierce winds blowing from the Arctic Ocean go deep into Russia's interior, and only in the southernmost Russian regions is the winter relatively mild. by the Russian standards. And actually, such close neighbors of Russia as Belarus or White Russia and the Ukraine experience already on average clearly milder winters, because they at least do not stretch into the frigid Central, Eastern and Northern Asia, as does Russia. They are sheltered from the worst Arctic, frosty Arctic air masses. Russia has had a history of authoritarian and autocratic rule, followed by relatively brief periods of more democratic rule. The latest period of relative democracy in Russia began, we can say, around 1988, 1989, when encouraged by the perestroika or restructuring and glasnost or openness, which also can be translated as the permission to say, as the late Finnish president Mr. Mauno Koivisto pointed out in one of his memoirs. In Russia itself, also the pro-democracy movement became encouraged. They started to, or various leaders of the pro-democracy movement started to look to such reform-minded Soviet and Russian communists as Mr. Boris Yeltsin. And indeed, Yeltsin was elected for the first time, was elected as the first directly elected Russian head of state, the Russian president, in, if I remember correctly, May or then June 1991. And as we know, in August of that year, a group of hardline Soviet communists staged a coup whose purpose was to end the democratic reforms of the Soviet Union and to reimpose an iron grip on the country, because already several states, most notably the Baltic states, Belarus and the Ukraine, had either broken away from the Soviet Union or had declared themselves as sovereign. And also in the Caucasus region, such countries as Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan were strongly in favor of leaving the Soviet Union, because one of the byproducts of the glasnost policy of relaxed censorship of the media and of private and even public expressions of opinion was that the long suppressed and denied feuds between different ethnic groups sprang into the surface. Although the Soviet Union had prided itself on being the indestructible union of many ethnic groups, to paraphrase the now defunct Soviet national anthem, in practice, the Russians were the dominant ethnic group politically, even though they comprised, before the Soviet Union started to break up around 1990, 1991, barely over half of the country's people. At most, the Soviet population was estimated at over 230 million people, if I remember correctly, or over 260. It could have been, yes. Anyway, nevertheless, most top politicians were ethnic Russians, although of course there were sizable minorities of, for example, Ukrainians and Belarusians and so forth. Then the non-Slavic minorities of the Soviet Union, such as the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Georgians, Armenians, and so forth. Well, they did have some quota-based representation in the the Soviet federal parliament, and then the government, but in practice, they didn't have an influential voice in the government because the Soviet communist ideology basically forbade the existence of ethnic and other conflicts. They were regarded as remnants of the old and backward bourgeois civilizations, conflicts based on ethnicity, of course, conflicts based on race, religion, history, and so forth, because supposedly they had already reached the road that would lead them to the earthly paradise of classless society, a paradise of the proletariat, the working people. In practice, of course, a tiny elite benefited at the expense of the working masses, and since the Soviet Union's breakup, not that much has changed. Surely a number of people have, through education, through effort, through generosity on the part of the state, private organizations, through God's grace above all, and then through what we humans often call luck, managed to rise, for example, from the lower classes and working classes to the middle class, or from the middle class to the upper middle class and upper class, but still the socioeconomic differences are wide in Russia. Interestingly enough, the gender differences also are, in terms of the average life span, because the Russian women on average live clearly longer, if I remember correctly, over 10 years longer than the Russian men. The Russian men's lifespan or lifespans are reduced, for example, by smoking, alcoholism, to some extent drugs, then work-related and other accidents, and crime. Despite President Putin's proclamation already back in 2000, if I remember correctly, either after or before his first election as president in that year, that a dictatorship of laws would rule over Russia during his presidency. Russia still has high rates of violent crime and property crime and so forth. Even its authoritarian government, which is a mixture of electoral democracy and then one-party dominant dictatorship or quasi-dictatorship, because the United Russia Party wins election after election, especially at the federal level, whether they be presidential ones or parliamentary ones. And often various opposition parties and groups boycott and then protest against those elections because they believe that they are neither free nor fair, and to a significant extent such foreign observers as those sent by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the European Union and Amnesty International and so forth, to a large extent they concur with such protests. To take a recent example, according to the official results, some 76%, so roughly 3/4 of the participating voters, according to the official results, as I said, re-elected Vladimir Putin as president in March 2018. But once again, there were allegations on the part of various opposition parties and groups, and even of international organizations, that the elections were neither fully free nor fully fair. The next presidential elections in Russia are scheduled for 2024. I just wonder how long President Putin wants to or dares to keep governing Russia. The presidential term used to be 4 years, but it has now been extended to 6 years, and the term limits haven't yet kicked in, except that Putin did temporarily retire from the presidency in 2008 to allow a close political ally, Mr. Dmitry Medvedev, to be elected as president, while Putin moved to occupy the position of prime minister, and in 2012 they switched jobs. Medvedev accepted appointment by the re-elected President Putin as the prime minister. Russia is in practice an authoritarian, partly dictatorial, partly democratic presidential republic. Despite being called the Russian Federation, in practice it is quite centralized. The federal government has, for example, or then the president himself has, for example, the right to appoint nowadays the regional governors. There used to be free gubernatorial elections, but using apparently that old argument according to which Russia has to have a strong central government, it can't allow the regions to have a wide self-government. The regional gubernatorial elections were then ended, although the municipal elections do feature mayoral elections, at least for the major Russian cities such as St. Petersburg and Moscow. The president has the power to appoint, however, with the Duma's approval, the Duma being the Russian Federal Parliament's lower house, which is directly elected for 5 years, and which the president can dissolve under some circumstances. However, with the restriction that if only 6 months remain of the Duma's official term, then the president can no longer dissolve it. If the Duma manages to pass, if I remember correctly, either twice in 3 months or twice in 6 months, a non-confidence motion against the Russian federal cabinet, then the president must either dissolve the Duma and call early federal parliamentary elections or dismiss the government. The president can, however, at any moment dismiss the prime minister. In such a case, however, he must propose a new candidate for prime minister to the Duma, and that candidate must obtain an absolute majority in order to be confirmed. So this is one democratic safeguard. The Russian parliament's upper house is called the Council of the Federation, and its members are appointed by the regional governments, so that 2 deputies of the Council of Federation represent a region. While in Russia currently there are regular elections, both executive elections, the presidential elections at the federal level, and then the mayoral elections at the local or municipal level, and then legislative elections both at the federal level and I think the regional level and the municipal level. There is clearly a deficit of democracy. In practice, only some or a few opposition parties have a realistic chance of being represented in the federal parliament, partly because of the vote, the electoral system, but partly also because there is a strict requirement according to which, in order to be registered as a political party, the party has to have a certain number or percentage of supporters in relation to the eligible voters, and it must have supporters in a majority of Russia's regions. And this many regard as a too heavy restriction against genuinely democratic opposition parties. There used to be a liberal opposition party called Yabloko, or Apple, in the Russian Duma, but it gradually lost its seats. Then a more conservative opposition party, the Union of Right Forces, also lost its seats. If I remember correctly, currently in the Russian parliament there are only 3 opposition parties, each of which has clearly fewer seats than the ruling party, United Russia. There is the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which despite its name is a far-right and ultranationalist party led by Mr. Vladimir Zhirinovsky. Then there is the Communist Party, which at least has been led by Mr. Gennady Zyuganov. And then there's the Just Russia Party. At the regional and municipal level, of course, there are other parties. And there are other registered parties even at the federal level, but they have been unable to win seats in the most recent elections. The Russian culture is a mixture of European, Slavic, of course Slavic, and other Eastern European, partly even Northern European, and of course Central and Western European, and then various Asian influences, and of course, especially since the 20th century, it has incorporated influences from the North American culture, especially the pop culture. And there is an ongoing debate about whether Russia is truly a European country or an Asian country, or then a mixture. I would say that it is both. It is both a European country and an Asian country. Most of its people live in Europe. Most of its inhabitants speak an Indo-European language, Russian, and its basic culture is, despite the strong Asian influences, still more European than Russian. More European than Asian. However, it is not a purely European country, if there are such countries, given the millennia of contacts between peoples of various continents, nationalities. Russia does not have that many lakes, but it does have long rivers, especially the Volga in western Russia, and then on the Asian side, Ob, Yenisei, Lena, and from the Lena River, the Russian and then Soviet Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin took his name. He was born as Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. And then in Russian there is that patronymic form of addressing people. It is somewhere between the familiar informal you and then the polite you, which are used in probably many languages, if not most languages of the world, at least most major languages of the world. So some examples. The current Russian president, Mr. Vladimir Putin, happens actually to have had a father who also is called Vladimir. So his official name is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. In other words, Vladimir's son, Putin. His predecessor, first predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, was actually called Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, or Boris Nikolai's son Yeltsin. And the last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, is actually called Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, or Mikhail Sergei's son Gorbachev. And then the Russian women are called, for example, Anna Sergeyevna, or Anna, Sergei's daughter, Anna Nikolaevna, or let's say Svetlana Nikolayevna, Svetlana, Nikolai's daughter, then Irina Vladimiryevna, or something like that, Irina Vladimir's daughter. So it's a curious mixture. And of course, the Russian last names do have that feminine form, most commonly either Va, Va, or then Na, Na, as the suffix. So for example, the current Russian president's former wife, during their marriage, had the surname Putina, and then the, I think, still surviving widow of the late Russian president Boris Yeltsin is called Naina Yeltsina. The late wife of former Soviet president Mikhail Gorbachev was called Raisa Gorbacheva, and so forth. Russians have a reputation as hosts of being friendly, happy, hospitable, despite the fact that many of them are still poor. But if they really want to show love and caring for a guest, they will go to great lengths to prepare as many foods and drinks for the meals as they can, pooling their resources together. And of course, if the guests are polite and loving and caring, they will greatly thank the hosts, even if the guests were economically much richer than their Russian hosts. Russians are also reportedly quite openly emotional people, quick to laugh, quick to cry, and so forth, although of course there are always exceptions to such generalizations. Russians love to drink various beverages, yes, vodka and beer, various wines and so forth, although they of course drink also water and milk, buttermilk, juice, mead, and so forth. The Russian cuisine is of course varied. It includes many soups, for example cabbage soups, various vegetable soups, meat soups, fish soups. Russians eat also a lot of potatoes, much bread, and so forth, and many onions, at least in the traditional Russian diets. So Russia is definitely a country worth visiting, and then of course, because Russia is not a full democracy by the Western standards, it is wiser for the visitors, especially if they come from the democratic European countries, North American countries, Australia and New Zealand, that they keep mostly or fully quiet about Russian politics, that they only engage Russians in such conversations if they know those Russians personally and trust them, and they let the Russians to bring up politics instead of bringing it up. It is much safer to talk about the Russian culture, the Russian language, the Russian cuisine, the colorful Russian national costumes, the Russian literature, the Russian music, the Russian history, however, steering clear of controversial political topics, such as communism, because there are many Russians who still harbor a certain degree of nostalgia for the communism, that their motherland, as they call it, instead of fatherland, or Radina, homeland, was then respected. Food was much more readily available in shops. There wasn't such a visible and radical difference between the rich and the poor, although of course we should always add that the KGB, the Soviet secret police spied on many, if not most, Russians and other inhabitants of the Soviet Union, and even party membership in the worst days, especially in Stalin, was no guarantee that one would even remain physically alive until old age. Gradually, during Khrushchev's time at least, the execution of long-term or even short-term Russian Communist Party members became rare, but imprisonment was still rather common. And then, here I'm paraphrasing what the late Finnish president Mr. Mauno Koivisto wrote in his memoirs, first or second, presidential memoirs, first or second volume, that during the long rule of the late Soviet president and general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Leonid Brezhnev, especially the faithful servants of the, or officials of the Soviet Communist Party, could be quite sure that they would keep their positions until retirement if they served General Secretary and later President Brezhnev faithfully. Okay, this is enough for this video. Take care and God bless you.